Hello, I'm the Game Professor, and welcome to the fifth and penultimate episode of Games as Lit 101's deep dive into the 2007 Square Enix RPG, The World Ends With You. Today we summarize and analyze the final third of the game as we build up to the last episode in this video series and our ultimate thesis on the game. Since this is part of a larger series, I highly recommend going back to the first video on The World Ends With You and starting from there, because the information and analysis provided in this video is based on information and analysis provided in previous ones. And obviously, spoiler warning, this is a super good game and you should really play it for yourself instead of watching some YouTube rando explain it to you. So then, on to Neku's final week in the Reaper's game. When we last left off, he had survived his second game with Joshua as his partner, but Joshua had sacrificed himself to protect Neku from Minamimoto's final attack, and Neku was thrown into a third game with all of the other players taken as his entry fee this time around. So, let's see how Neku expands his world in the final chapter of The World Ends With You. The first day of week 3 begins with Neku searching for a partner, only to realize the trick that was played. Since his entry fee is all the other players, he's alone, which means he's toast. But as Uzuki and Karia are about to finish him off, Beat shows up and expresses his frustration at the way the Game Master has broken the game and cheated Neku out of any chance. So, he defects from the Reapers, making a pact with Neku and allowing the game to continue. Beat's motivations throughout the game have been something of a mystery, as it hasn't yet filled us in on why he's making the decisions he's making. But this is the week we're finally going to have enough information to talk about his character arc. Beat says he defected because he was frustrated at how cheap and dishonorable the Reapers were being, and also that he owed Neku for returning Grime's pendant in week 2. Clearly, Neku's compassion, even when Beat was attacking him, struck a chord. Meanwhile, we see a bit more of Miss Konishi, the Game Master for the week. She's very calculated and plays the system to exploit it in any way she can to produce the outcome she wants. Beat's defection was unexpected though, so she has to adjust her plan. The conductor decides to strip Beat of his Reaper abilities for defecting, effectively demoting him back to a normal player. This also means Miss Konishi can't just erase him the way she would a stray Reaper, but she still has an obligation to bring about his erasure through the rules of the game. We also find out that all the Reapers are being required to wear these red player pins, which apparently enhance their abilities in EUG. The next day, we find out that Beat wants to take down the composer and take his place, not to rule over the Shibuya Underground, but to end the game permanently and free everyone in it. But Miss Konishi shows up in person, saying she knows they're going to cause trouble and is going to keep a close eye on them. And since Beat is a player again, she has to take his entry fee, the squirrel-looking noise that's been perched on his shoulder since week 2. She turns it back into a pin and gives them their mission: find and defeat her within the next 6 days. Incidentally, Beat has 5 days until he's automatically erased for having gotten no points as a Reaper. When Miss Konishi disappears, Beat is adamant that becoming the composer means nothing if he doesn't have that pin. Neku is uncertain why a little noise means so much to him, but Beat just responds by saying that it isn't noise. Turns out, the UG is now under emergency call due to some kind of threat, which allows Reapers to attack players directly. Neku wonders why they weren't just erased if their involvement made circumstances so dire, but instead Reapers just attack them on a regular basis. By the end of the day, even 777 attacks them, trying to claim the bounty on their heads. Once defeated, he tells Beat and Neku to end him, but Beat refuses, saying he didn't even want to fight, let alone kill him. 777 is grateful and leaves, but unfortunately is immediately erased by Miss Konishi for the mercy he showed. The next day, Uzuki has been given the squirrel pin and granted some Game Master privileges for the day, and tells them they're playing Reaper game number 4. Beat, of course, does not remember which one that is, and by the time Neku figures out they're on the wrong track, Uzuki shows up frustrated that they're not even trying to catch her. Turns out Reaper game number 4 is Tag, so Neku just reaches out while she's ranting and tags her. Ultimately, Karia talks her down, but the next day is his turn to challenge them. Karia's game is centered around a series of clues that lead Neku and Beat to the place where Rhyme and Beat died in a car crash. We'll go over the details of this when we talk about Beat's character arc. The important revelation for now is that the squirrel noise is actually Rhyme. The way Mr. Hanekoma saved Beat back when Rhyme was initially erased was by capturing Rhyme's soul and putting it into this pin so that Beat could form a contract with it. And now, Beat's ultimate goal is to bring her back fully. I also want to note that while the game's localization is generally quite excellent, even with all the angsty teen talk, there is this one bit where Neku asks Beat why he let his rents keep him down, and just... rents? Has anyone said that ever? Once they complete the mission and hold their own in a battle against Karya and Uzuki, Beat realizes that the pin Miss Konishi gave them isn't the real one, and Uzuki's ambition was exploited to try and erase the two of them without actually giving her any real authority. In frustration, Uzuki helps Neku across more of the UG, saying, "The UG needs you two to have this." Meanwhile, we see Minamimoto in a new, noise-looking body. The next day is when things start getting weird and really building up toward the game's climax. The people of the RG are acting strange. Their eyes glow red, and we see everyone, including characters we know, repeating this line both out loud and in their own thoughts. To right the countless wrongs of our day, we shine this light of true redemption, that this place may become as paradise. What a wonderful world such would be. And it's not just the people of the RG. Reapers are saying the same thing and attacking Beat and Neku. But what's puzzling them is that everyone who's glowing red and spouting this mantra is wearing that red player pin. Beat forms the theory that Cat is the composer and that he's the one doing this. But Neku knows that Mr. Hanakoma is Cat, and he doesn't think that could really be the case. He told me, he says, expand your horizons, enjoy the moment, the exact opposite of what's happening around us. This Shibuya isn't Shibuya at all. He'd never do this. But when they come across the place where Minamimoto had made that taboo noise sigil, Neku takes a picture with his time-traveling phone camera, which finally does actually come into play in the main story here, and sees that Mr. H had been there days earlier. This increases their suspicions. They try to get to Wildcat to get answers from Mr. H, but when they get there, the place has been completely trashed, and Hanakoma is nowhere to be found. But he leaves something there for them that will get them to the Shibuya River, so they head that way, only to run into Minamimoto. Apparently, being defeated and reborn in a taboo form through the sigil was part of his plan all along, and he's now powerful enough to rival the composer. Indeed, the next day, as the entirety of Shibuya has come to a halt and Beat is slowly fading from sight, Minamimoto has broken through the barrier to the Shibuya River. When Neku and Beat enter, Minamimoto shows up and tells them that Miss Konishi was hiding in Beat's shadow the whole game, gathering data on them. She reveals herself since she's been found out, and understands the two of them well enough now that she actually mimics Beat's exact words as he says them. She attacks, in probably the most confusing boss fight of the game, but they ultimately defeat her and continue on. The next while contains a few revelations, notably that Shiki is here now, and that Minamimoto has actually been crushed underneath one of his own junk piles by something, apparently far more powerful than himself. When Neku, Beat, and Shiki get to the conductor, Mr. Kitaniji, he announces that the game is over, and they are all ex-players, simply dead people. He puts one of those pins on Shiki, which compels her to attack Neku and Beat. The ensuing fight puts the conductor, Beat, and Shiki out of commission, leaving Neku to walk alone to the composer through a passage full of Cat's art. This is a point for Neku to reflect on how his friends have gotten him to this point, and even though he's now convinced that Mr. H is the composer, he plans to finish this for them, and because of the things that Hanakoma had taught him. So he starts yelling for Mr. H to come out and face him, but he's faced instead, once again, by the conductor. The conductor explains that not only is the composer not Mr. Hanakoma, but the composer isn't here, and hasn't been for any of the time Neku has been playing the Reaper's game. The conductor's been in charge for that entire time. This changes our understanding of a variety of plot points, including the fact that Shiki couldn't have been resurrected even if she hadn't been taken as Neku's entry fee for week 2, and that this whole thing going on with the pins taking over minds isn't actually the composer's doing in the first place, but instead the conductor's. Neku asks why the conductor would do this, and he answers, "Music requires many things, melody, performers, instruments, but the key element in the most divine music is a conductor, to hold it all together. The world is very much the same. Under one conductor, one ideal, the world of men marches towards bliss. Didn't you feel it in Shibuya? Rage, hate, misery, envy, fear, self-deprecation, a cacophony of countless selfish wants. As that noise swells, it turns into crime, warfare. All the world's ills can be traced to individuality." Like I've said before, this game is a lot of things, but subtle is not one of them. Neku rejects the conductor's notions, now having learned how healthy it can be to learn from other people, so the conductor destroys his player pin to try and take control of him like he has everyone else. But he still can't do it, so he resorts to erasing him instead, at which point Beat and Shiki show up, chastising Neku for leaving them behind. "Yo, forget this partner crap. You ain't my partner anymore, man. You're my friend. So trust that, yo." Okay, sorry, obviously I can't convincingly speak Beat's dialect, but there we have it. It's here we see the return of a surprising character, Joshua. But in response, the conductor captures Neku's 3 partners and begins the game's final battle, in which Neku must take advantage of his partners' openings to accept their help, ultimately resulting in a 4-way fusion that ends the battle for good. When this is all done, we find out what's really been going on the whole time. Joshua is the composer. Before all this started, he'd become so frustrated that the people of Shibuya were drifting apart and failing to understand each other, he decided to destroy it. In a desperate gamble, the conductor proposed a game. Joshua retreated from the UG and chose a champion to represent him in one of the Reavers' games, Neku. If Neku won, Joshua would get his way and destroy Shibuya. But if the conductor could fix Shibuya in the time allotted, Joshua would reconsider. The use of the red player pins to mind meld everyone was the conductor's method of doing this, to eliminate individuality so everyone would understand everything the same way and thus understand each other perfectly. So despite all the mixed messages we got in week 2, Joshua did indeed kill Neku, while also shrugging off an assassination attempt by Minamoto. He also gave Neku an extra player pin, which is why the conductor couldn't control Neku even after destroying his first one. There's a lot of stuff here that completely changes the way we understand the story up to this point, but most of it comes down to this competition between Joshua and the conductor that would decide the fate of Shibuya. But ultimately, of course, Neku prevailed, which means Joshua won, and the conductor is erased, after thanking Joshua for allowing him this chance to save Shibuya. Joshua suggests one last game and hands Neku a pistol. They shoot at the same time, and the survivor gets control of the whole thing. Neku is understandably upset, having been played this whole time and now being treated like nothing by the person who used him, who he had, after a long and difficult journey, chosen to trust. Neku tearfully raises the gun in anger as Joshua continues counting, but ultimately thinks twice and lowers it again. And Neku wakes up in Scramble Crossing with no answers, alone. But in the real world. We hear Neku explain that he and the others met up in the real world 1 week later, assuming that Joshua had spared Shibuya on account of it still being there and them being alive. We see Neku, Beat, Rhyme, and Shiki, looking like her actual self, all meeting up at Hachiko. Neku tosses his headphones aside, discarding the symbol of his isolationism and permanently opening himself up to the people around him. And, in a special ending for 100% completion, we see Joshua looking on while Mr. H consoles him, saying that this is now their world, and they get to decide what to do with it. It's a fairly open-ended ending, but one that ties all the loose ends that need tying. Joshua has spared Shibuya in the hopes that Neku and his friends will continue to learn from each other, and with renewed hope that the city is capable of growing and changing for the better. And that's the end of The World Ends With You. Alright, feels good to finally get through all that after this absurdly long series. So, a lot of this stuff we're going to talk about in the final video, but for now, let's go over the stuff specific to this 3rd week. So we now have a pretty full view of the story of The World Ends With You. There's some world-building stuff we're going to get into in the last video of this series, but for the most part, we know everything we have to. There are just a few little tidbits we should acknowledge from the game's extra chapter, Another Day. The player can access Another Day after completing the game and a few more objectives, and for the most part, it doesn't have much to add. It's just a fun alternate universe game centered largely around Tin Pin Slammer, but it does include 2 important revelations. First, that Neku's distrust of others is largely rooted in a tragic event where a friend of his was killed on the way to visit him. The trauma from this event drove Neku to reject companionship for the sake of sparing himself any more pain. This also gives some insight into the way he reacted to Rhyme's death. The second is that Joshua's sacrifice at the end of week 2 was a ruse. He took the attack, but rather than dying, retreated to an alternate timeline to recover. This timeline is where Another Day takes place. Joshua ends up returning by the end of week 3 because Mr. Hanakoma goes to get him back, which is why Mr. H was absent for the last while of the game. It's not the most important bit of information, but it does help fill in some blanks. So now we have a couple things to look at before we get into the final analysis in the next video. Neku, of course, and what this third week contributed to his character arc, and Beat, because we finally have enough information to really talk about him. The first week is where Neku learned to accept others and let them into his life. The second week is when he saw a reflection of his old self in Joshua and really realized that's not who he wanted to be. The third week, then, is an opportunity for Neku to finally put his new beliefs into practice. This is where we get to see what the game's ideal worldview looks like on a practical level. Beat is the perfect partner for this. Different from Neku, but friendly to him. Someone who's serious about being a partner and a friend, but also who Neku will need to reach out to and understand if he is to work with him. There's a great sequence where Beat is overthinking things and kind of spiraling into sadness and questioning his self-worth, and Neku's response is, "Don't you turn into a deep thinker on me, yo." Aside from the awkward attempt to talk to Beat with his own vernacular at the end, which I relate to quite a bit, obviously, this is Neku affirming that Beat is who he is and that Neku is okay with that. He's not going to criticize his intelligence or insist that he do things differently, but accept him for who he is and work with him to make them both stronger. Leaps and bounds ahead of, "I got my values, so you can keep yours." But going any deeper into Neku's arc starts getting into the core thematic content of the game, which of course is what we're going to be talking about in the final video of the series. So for now, let's move on from Neku and talk about Beat. Quick recap, since we haven't gone over all the details of Beat's past yet. Beat and Rhyme are siblings. Rhyme was driven and smart, while Beat was never really passionate about anything and didn't do well in school. Their parents pressured Beat so much that, in his words, he gave up on himself in hopes that they would do the same. But Rhyme never did. She was there for him no matter what, even as he tried to push her away, all the way up until the car crash that killed them both. Things get even more tragic from there, though. Beat's entry fee for the game was Rhyme's memories of him. So not only did Rhyme not remember Beat, she didn't remember enough about her life in the RG to value it, which could have to do with her memories of Beat being taken, or could also indicate that her own entry fee was her own ambitions. She said she had no dreams, Beat explains. "Why come back to life if I've got nothing to live for?" she said. "That's all backwards. She's the one who had a million reasons to live." I realized something then. Rhyme's all I got left. So I said to myself, I gotta find the words, just like she did for me. Tell her dreams are coming, just like mine did, even if that's a big lie. But all I did is fool her into thinking I'm worth dying for. So obviously, Beat is suffering from self-esteem issues. In fact, there are a lot of parallels between him and Shiki in this regard. Both of them have trouble valuing themselves, even though the reasons why are very different, and both of them look to another as their source of self-worth. But in both cases, the comparison to that other person tends to only make things worse for them. But Beat's issue is less about how he sees himself and more about how others see him. He feels oppressed by his rent's insistence that he... Okay, sorry, I'm not doing that. He feels oppressed by his parents' insistence that he's not good enough, and even Rhyme's optimism about his prospects comes across to him as pity. Like most things in the game, the problem here is a failure to understand other people. First, on the part of the people surrounding Beat. It's easy for any of us with experience in educational systems to see how schools sometimes tend to fail children with different needs or various difficulties, and the pressure from Beat's parents indicates that they didn't really know how to reach out to their son in a loving and effective manner. But of course, Beat isn't guiltless either. He was so used to people looking down on him that he even read that condescension into Rhyme's unwavering support. He was so convinced of his own worthlessness that he wasn't able to recognize sincerity and love when it was directed at him. But the last bit of what Beat said here is what really breaks my heart. That in trying to encourage Rhyme, Beat not only feels he indirectly caused her death, but that he did so by being dishonest about his own worthlessness. All I did is fool her into thinking I'm worth dying for. In a way, Beat's entry fee is kind of the opposite of Neku's. Neku's memories were taken because they constituted his own worldview, which he valued above all else. It was a very self-serving thing that he valued most. But Rhyme's memories of and love for Beat were taken as Beat's entry fee because Beat valued what Rhyme saw in him more than anything he saw in himself. Beat was always capable of the kind of selfless love Neku had to learn, so much so that even his entry fee was taken from someone else rather than himself. All his love was directed at Rhyme, at that one person, and none at himself. He defined himself by how others saw him, and Rhyme's viewpoint was the only one that gave him any love for himself. With all this in mind, it's easier to understand the decisions he made throughout the game. Defecting to the Reapers in hopes that he would be able to bring Rhyme back with complete disregard for his own safety or ultimate fate, but in the process not losing his conscience or his connection to Neku because it wasn't about an amoral or cynical pursuit of power, but about acting on selfless, reckless love. And ultimately defecting back to Neku when his conscience was too heavy, because it was never about loyalty to the Reapers or apathy toward his friends, but about his best chance to bring back Rhyme, and he was no longer letting others tell him how to make that happen. Thus, his plan to take over the entire operation and do it his own way. Ultimately, the game dances a nice line between using Beat as the butt monkey of the game. One of my favorite running jokes is the tendency for people to insult Beat using big words, only for him to reply with something like, "That's right," because he doesn't realize he's being insulted, and nicely affirming him and validating his existence and experiences. It doesn't make excuses for his impulsive behavior and unintelligent demeanor so much as it simply says, "That's all right. This is you. And you're still growing." Because ultimately, the key to Beat growing as a person isn't that he strives for the approval of others and bases his self-worth on how they view him, but that he understands himself and surrounds himself with others who understand him too. Once again, it comes down to putting in the effort to understand others, especially when they're different from you. And this even ties that process into understanding and valuing yourself as well. And, well, this is a bit shorter than the summary and analysis videos in this series have usually been, but talking about Neku in Week 3 leads pretty directly into the final conclusions about the game, so that's for the next video, which I promise this time will be very, very soon. If you want to make sure you know when that happens, hit that subscribe button and make sure to click the little bell, too, because YouTube's very bad at actually telling people when things happen. There are also links in the description to follow Games as Lit 101 on various social media platforms, and to support it on Patreon if that's something you're interested in doing. So make sure to join us next time as we conclude this video series on The World Ends With You. Until then, class dismissed.